Hey everyone, it's Lexie. So in today's video, I'm really excited for this one. This is inspired by a video that I saw Leonie do on the book Leo, so I'll link that down below if you want to go and check it out. But it's basically like a analysis on how your reading has changed over the years, specifically how kind of Booktube has changed it. So I thought this was really good. It includes a lot of graphs, and as a PhD student, as like an engineer, I was like, this is really good ideas. So I have my laptop right here, so at a different angle today. I'm on my bed. But I thought this would be fun to look at how my reading tastes have changed over the years, and this was actually really interesting. I went on Goodreads and started looking at like the stats of every year, and then I compiled it into kind of, there's basically a books read per year, and then per year I do a breakdown on like the reading age in terms of like if it's YA or adult, middle grade, that type of thing, and then also a genre breakdown, which I think is very interesting because I didn't discover Booktube until 2015, so you can kind of see how me discovering Booktube, and I became a Booktuber in 2015, how my reading has changed since I initially joined and how it's kind of, you know, settled down as I've kind of found my, like, what I enjoy reading. So yeah, without further ado, let's get started. So this is like not the optimal angle, but I'm like, we're just gonna deal with it. But essentially, I have my laptop here. So let's start out with the books per year. So I didn't start inputting things into Goodreads until April of 2014. So overall, April has had like the lowest amount, but it also, I wasn't on it the longest. So that's, you know, somewhat, you know, a little skewed because it's not the full 12 years, but we can see it's had a steady increase over the years. 2015, you know, I was averaging about 20 books per year. In 2015 I went to 26 books, which I think is really good. 2016 is where it really skyrocketed, and that's where it kind of went up. So I ended up reading 52 books in 2016, which is really good. I think like even now I use 50 as a good goal because for me that feels like a lot, but I think like around 2014, 2015 is where I really started to get into reading and finding books that I enjoy. So you can kind of see how that and discovering Booktube and kind of discovering more books, I think really impacted that. 2017 I went down, but 2017 was, you know, a rough year. I tore my ACL. All fun and games. I had surgery, great fun. But you know, right now I feel like it's really kind of, I've maxed out on 2018, 2019 is where I kind of maxed out. So I was at 62 in 2018 and 64 in 2019. So I think like, you know, 50 plus or minus like 3 I think is like ideal. So, you know, you can steadily have increased, and I think now reading is kind of definitely become my hobby. So I read instead of like watching Netflix. I think that's like the biggest change, you know, right now, just looking at that. So moving on to the genre breakdown for 2014, you can see it was very kind of diverse. Fantasy is definitely the smallest out of all of these here, which I think is very interesting. Keep your eyes on that. But you can see, like, you know, I read quite a bit, like an equal amount of contemporary, just standard literary fiction, historical fiction, thriller, murder mysteries, and non-fiction. So I didn't read a lot of fantasy pre-Booktube, which I think is very interesting. And even just looking at the age breakdown, you can see that the majority of books, like the mass majority of books I read, were adult, and I think that's pretty relevant. Like prior to Booktube I did read more adult literary fiction and not a lot of fantasy. Like the fantasy that I read prior to Booktube, like the only ones I read were like Harry Potter, and I didn't know about like Lunar Chronicles, like all the big like fantasy YA, like Sarah J Maas I'd never heard of until Booktube. And I think that's very interesting. You can see like how I was right before I discovered Booktube, and I think that is very, very interesting. Alrighty, so now we're moving on to 2015, the year that I officially discovered Booktube and started my Booktube channel. So we can see that, yes, the vast majority of the books I read were fantasy, and that's really relevant. I think like a lot of Booktube channels talk about fantasy, and like I said, the only fantasy I read prior to that was basically, you know, I guess like the Spiderwick Chronicles. but like, you know, just like the, you know, YA fantasy series that everyone kind of knows. So that's very interesting. I did read quite a bit of contemporary. I read no nonfiction or thrillers that year, which really surprises me. And I read, you know, 2 books of just regular fiction and 1 historical fiction. So that's very like a deep contrast compared to 2014, where, you know, I was very kind of well-rounded in what I was reading. Here it's strictly fantasy, and I think part of it is also because of the pressure of reading a lot of the books, especially when you start out a Booktube channel. It's like reading all the books a lot of people talk about to just kind of gain a wider audience, and I think that's relevant here. And then so even looking at the age breakdown, you can see it is complete opposite of last, like 2014, and it is the majority YA. Like 81% of this is YA, and then the rest is adult, which I think is super interesting. Just very interesting. Like, you can see how Booktube, within a span of, you know, like 1 year, completely changed my reading habits. Like, that's really fascinating. So looking at the genre breakdown for 2016, it kind of studies itself out. It's like, I don't know what I was doing. Like, I read the majority of it was fantasy again. I kind of had more to contemporary, literary fiction, historical fiction, thriller, and nonfiction. So I still kind of, you know, had more variety, but it was still predominantly fantasy. Still fantasy heavy. I think this is when I was reading like the Lunar Chronicles, the Throne of Glass series. I think this is when I kind of started reading those, which is very interesting. And then here things kind of even out a little bit in terms of the age breakdown. It's a good balance between adult and YA, I think. Like, it's pretty even, like 52% to 48%. So it's like about even. It's kind of balancing out. I kind of found my rhythm, and I feel like it's very interesting. Like, that's totally interesting. And I realized the colors on these charts are a little bit different. Oops. So looking at the genre breakdown for 2017, this is like still, you know, like I think this is more representative of what I kind of read currently. So it was majority historical fiction. It was, you know, equal, like somewhat equal amounts of thriller, murder mysteries, fantasy, contemporary fiction, and then there was a small little bit of nonfiction. So I think this is, out of the years so far compared to like prior to Booktube, this is the most well-rounded in terms of genre, which I think is really interesting. And here we can also see the general age breakdown is kind of going back to what, sorry, I got an email, it's kind of going back to what it was prior to Booktube. So we can see now it's more like, you know, 70% adult, 30% YA, which is kind of where I kind of lean now, which I think is super interesting. You can see like how initially starting with Booktube, I kind of was kind of geared towards what a lot of people on Booktube tend to read, and then after like the first 2 years of that, I kind of, you know, have settled down, kind of going back into what I was reading prior to Booktube, which I think is just super interesting. Alrighty, so I fixed the 2016 color, so we're doing good, and we're moving on into 2018 now. Again, you can see it was still very fantasy heavy. Like, fantasy is like I said, I'd never really read any fantasy prior to Booktube, so that must have been the year there's a lot of fantasy coming out. I think that's, I'm trying to think, like, I don't remember what I read that year. But, you know, majority fantasy, an equal balance of nonfiction. I read 9 nonfiction that year. That's pretty good. You know, 7 thriller, murder mysteries, 12 historical fiction. So it's still kind of, you know, I have that variety, and then, you know, a little bit of literary fiction and contemporary. So it's kind of shifted now. I was doing pretty good in 2017, keeping it somewhat balanced, and then it kind of shifted again to more fantasy, which is something surprised me because, like I said, prior to Booktube, I never read any fantasy, and I think the majority of what, of like this side of my bookshelf is now fantasy, which I think is very interesting. And the age breakdown too, it's still skewed more towards the adult side. I think this is when I was starting to reread the Harry Potter series, so I think that kind of tied in, but it was still now it's kind of going back to normal with more adult than YA, which is how I kind of do my reading now. So for genre breakdown in 2019, this was mostly fantasy, like it was an equal amount of fantasy and thriller and murder mysteries. This is when I definitely was marathoning the Tracy Crosswhite series and the Erica Foster series, so it's kind of a good variety there. A little bit of nonfiction, a very small part of it is, you know, literary fiction, and then like an equal balance of historical fiction and contemporary. So I'm trying to think what I read, part of it too is also because I do a book club with my friend, and starting in 2018, and we read mostly fantasy, so I think that's part of it as well. Just the book club adding to that reading, I think that's probably, I figured it out. So that's why I kind of fantasy kind of was skewed a little bit more. Very interesting. But you can see even in 2019 that it is predominantly more adult. More adult compared to 2018, which is very, very interesting, if you ask me. So that's really interesting. And so I also did like a overview of, if I can find it, of like a age breakdown over the 6 years from 2014 to 2019. So overall, I have majority of what I've read for the age range of the whole years is predominantly adult, which is not surprising. As I said, like prior to Booktube, I read mostly adult fiction or adult novels, and even now I still tend to lean more towards that, but I definitely have, since starting compared to 2014 to now, it's kind of, Booktube has introduced me to more YA stories and authors, so that's evident as well, but it's still predominantly I read adult. So this is interesting. So this genre breakdown, like, so if you look at 2014, I think I had like one or no fantasy in there. So it's very interesting looking at the genre breakdown over the 6 years, because it is, you know, 40% fantasy, and then it's an equal balance between historical fiction and thriller murder mysteries, which is interesting because I still consider myself as a kind of channel that focuses more on like historical fiction and thriller novels, which is very interesting because it's still predominantly, you know, fantasy based, but I blame the initial years of Booktube for that. And then let's see, I also have, you know, it's like an equal balance of contemporary, just general literary fiction and nonfiction, so it's kind of equally balanced, which I think is super interesting. Just like looking at that has made me realize just how my reading has changed over the years. It's definitely very interesting looking at it from that perspective, and especially because I have like a pre-Booktube, and then like how my reading was changing between when I started my Booktube channel, and then how it's kind of like settled down into something that's a little bit more diverse, which I think is very interesting. It shows how Booktube changes your reading habits, maybe for the better or for worse, depending on how you look at it, but nevertheless, very, very interesting. But yeah, that's kind of it for this video. I feel like I was really nerding out about these, you know, statistics, but you know, let me know if you guys liked this type of video. I think it's interesting, especially because I have it kind of documented for so long on Goodreads. It's very, very interesting. So definitely within a few years from now we can see how my reading has changed since, you know, maybe 2019, which I'm curious about. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys next time. Bye guys!